First UN week for Donald Trump. Does it usher in a new world order? After saying as a candidate that he wasn't a fan of the world body, the U.S. president chairing a conference on reforming its institutions. This at the outset of the annual opening of the United Nations General Assembly. We'll ask what the current White House really thinks of the UN. This after a week where there was unanimity at the Security Council on North Korea and hints that Washington may not be dropping the Paris Climate Change Pact after all. And so begs the broader question, how does the United States see itself on the world stage? Long gone, of course, were the days when George W. Bush invaded Iraq in the name of democracy and freedom. So does foreign policy limit itself to defending strategic interests and trade? And how much or how little does diplomacy matter to an administration that's yet to fill many vacant posts, like ambassador to Paris? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Donald Trump's first UN weekend. Joining us from New York, Jonathan Wachtel, former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations. Thanks for joining us. From Boise, Idaho, the former chair of that state's Republican Party, former senior White House National Security Advisor, Stephen Yates. Welcome back to the show.
So it's going to be my phone?
Okay.
Welcome back from Washington, Jim Markakis, president of the Progressive Political Action Committee, 4DPAC.
Thanks for having me.
And from London, Leslie Vinjamuri. She teaches international relations at SOAS, the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. He did get a free plug-in for the real estate he owns near UN headquarters, but then Donald Trump got down to business. In his first speech there as U.S. president, Trump calling for a cut in the world body's bureaucracy.
We seek a United Nations that regains the trust of the people around the world. In order to achieve this, the United Nations must hold every level of management accountable, protect whistleblowers, and focus on results rather than on process. To honor the people of our nations, we must ensure that no one and no member state shoulders a disproportionate share of the burden, and that's militarily or financially. We also ask that every peacekeeping mission have clearly defined goals and metrics for evaluating success.
Let me begin with you, Jim Markakis. Which Donald Trump was that we heard? We heard in those remarks, no member state should shoulder a disproportionate share of the burden. Was that an America First statement? Because after all, we did then hear the UN Secretary General agree that, well, there is too much bureaucracy at the UN.
Sure, of course there's too much bureaucracy at any major multilateral institution like the United Nations. That doesn't mean that there's no use for it. Of course, there's great use for the United Nations, for the United States, and as the largest, richest country in the world, the United States should continue to pay a significant portion of the United Nations budget. But to your question about which Donald Trump is this is the Donald Trump that reads off of a teleprompter or a prepared speech that some of his more traditionally conservative internationalist Republican advisors have written for him. And frankly, it's not worth the piece of paper it's written on, because he says one thing out of a teleprompter one day and he can go hit Twitter or say something off the cuff to the reporters the next day. So there's strategic incoherence from the Trump administration. They say one thing but follow up is almost non-existent.
Yeah, Stephen Yates, what was your reaction when you saw, there he is, Antonio Guterres, Donald Trump side by side? Very congenial. It looked like, just any U.S. president would at the start of UN week.
Well, every element of this so far is fairly conventional. I mean, the subjects that are on the agenda and the topics that he addressed, the priorities for the bilaterals, which are actually the meat of the UN General Assembly for a U.S. president, are all very conventional. We're dealing with North Korea, Iran, the topic of reform of the Security Council or process in the UN, burden sharing on resources, So a lot of this is a fairly mainstream agenda that probably surprises people who expected a more shocking approach to the system by Donald Trump or the United States right now. But it's consistent with what we've seen in recent weeks and months with General Kelly as chief of staff and a somewhat more focused approach by the administration to international challenges.
Yeah, you agree then with what was said by Jim there about him, sticking to the script? Because later on, for instance, there was a reporter who asked Trump what he'd do about the Iran nuclear deal, and he said, quote, "You'll be seeing very soon."
Yeah, well, that is vintage Trump. Unfortunately, I couldn't hear the other guests, so I don't know what he said, but I do agree with that premise. I mean, he has stuck to a script. He is actually kind of conveying more strategically his messaging in public and private. I don't think that this makes it less likely that he'll tweet something that might change the discourse. That's somewhat his negotiating posture. He'll set out a mainstream agenda, he'll have a private meeting, and then he'll try to use whatever leverage he has to pressure the other side. So I still expect those cards to be played, but so far it's been a very mainstream playing of a hand in opening round of the UN.
All right, so far sticking to the script, at least in that first speech. Leslie Vincent-Murray, which Donald Trump is it that shows up at UN week? Of course, it all depends on those tweets. What are your thoughts when, for instance, when he talks about North Korea's leader as Rocket Man in a tweet? Is that just entertainment, or is it something more serious?
I think the key thing to remember here is that Donald Trump is always talking to multiple audiences. He clearly uses different mechanisms for communicating, but he's also thinking about different people. I mean, I think when he tweets, we have to remember that he's really thinking very much about that base in the United States that he sees as being absolutely critical to his approval ratings, which, as we know, are very low at around 38%, have gone as low as 34%. And so we see these sort of two messages that are put out there, but that's partly because he's really just trying to hold on to the support that he has at home. But I think the broader question of what Donald Trump are we seeing at the United Nations? Well, first of all, it's impressive that he's there. It wasn't clear that he would engage with the United Nations at all. A number of the things are, as the previous commenters have said, conventional in one sense. But what remains very unconventional is what the baggage that is brought to the table right now when the United States turns up at the UN, given what this particular president has done diplomatically, right? He's alienated a number of America's traditional allies. And he's created a sense of unpredictability, which isn't necessarily strategic. So there's a lot of incoherence and uncertainty hovering around this. And so I think a lot of people are waiting to see how the engagement goes forward.
Has he turned a corner with last week getting consensus at the Security Council on North Korea, for instance?
Turned a corner. Has the President of the United States of America become more coherent? He certainly has tried to put more pressure on North Korea. The sanctions are worthwhile in terms of being symbolic, in terms of getting everybody on board, but they were very significantly watered down. But when we say, has the president turned a corner? Well, the rhetoric continues to be inflammatory, not helpful in terms of actually moving diplomacy forward. There's no military option for dealing with North Korea that the United States should engage in, and the president and those people around him aren't effectively trying to move diplomacy forward. So it'll be very interesting to watch what happens at the UN when it comes to the discussion surrounding North Korea.
Jonathan Wachtel, your thoughts on what we can expect when there's that big speech by Donald Trump on Tuesday? Will it be more of what we heard earlier?
It's hard to predict, isn't it? The speech is still being worked on, but you can expect the president to come in strong on a variety of issues, especially North Korea, especially Iran. I mean, today's topic was UN reform, which, let's face it, it's an important subject matter, but it's not a headline grabber in terms of world affairs. I would expect him to come on pretty strong, though, in terms of trying to force through a message to actually Kim Jong-un, even, you know, being in front of 193 member states of the United Nations, including the North Koreans who are members of this organization, to try to message to him that the international community is united against what he's doing, and he's got to cut it out.
You say UN reform is perhaps not a top headline grabber, but when you take into consideration that the U.S. pays for what? 1/5 of the UN's budget, 1/3 of its peacekeeping budget. When Donald Trump speaks about it, what are your thoughts? Where is it going? Is the U.S. going to radically slash its contribution?
You know, the contribution for the general budget is 22%. That used to be higher, actually. It was brought down by a former diplomat named Richard Holbrooke from a number closer to a quarter of the overall budget of the UN. You know, there is that option down the road, obviously. There is a precedent I just talked about. But the truth is that budget is part of an assessed contribution. It's something that, you know, each country, depending on their GDP and other factors, contributes according to what they should be carrying in what is perceived as an equitable way. But the truth is the United States does carry the lion's share of the burden of covering UN costs. You mentioned the peacekeeping as well. That's something that the United States has been working very hard at reforming so that these missions are actually fulfilling their mandates and you're getting rid of some of the waste. You know, if you go to a place like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for instance, a huge peacekeeping contingent there. Many of the peacekeepers never left their bases out of fear, actually, of getting pelted with stones if they go out into Kinshasa, or you know, other factors in which, you know, there was really no reason for them to be there, actually. So you've seen that peacekeeping mission trimmed down, and you know, when you bring down a head count of a peacekeeping mission, when you have soldiers really just, you know, twiddling their thumbs, I'm sorry to be disparaging that way, you know, it's important to look at problem areas like that and eliminate it and make sure that the mission is actually purposeful and actually carrying out what it's supposed to do without, you know, paying for needless waste.
Cutting down on waste, suddenly we had a statement last Friday that turned heads. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, your former boss, she praised the United Nations openly. Let's listen to Nikki Haley.
The UN has shifted over the past several months. It's not just about talking, it's about action. The members are starting to get used to act, whether it's Security Council resolutions, whether it's with UN reform, whether it's with peacekeeping. We're starting to see a lot of changes at the UN.
Jim Markakis, 9 months ago, we weren't hearing these kinds of remarks. How do you interpret that?
You know, Nikki is speaking
you know,
to
Nikki
what?
Haley-
Jim Markakis.
I'm sorry, I'm getting an echo in my ear and hearing my voice coming back at me. So if you guys can correct that, it would make this easier. But to answer
let me
your
go to
question,
Jim Markakis
Francois,
first, please, on this. Jim Markakis.
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, it's in Ambassador Haley's interest to laud the United Nations, especially because her boss is so unpredictable and isolationist and has a reputation of wanting to draw America back from world affairs. So, you know, she's trying to play nice, but really, let's also cut to the larger picture. When we start talking about budget reform and we start talking about you know, the American contribution to the United Nations, in terms of the United States national budget, it's really fractions of a penny in terms of what we spend. So let's not get caught up in a debate about a few $million here or there. Yes, it's important. Yes, it's a worthy topic to discuss, but it is not sort of life-altering.
Hang on, but she made those remarks. You say she's just playing nice, for playing to the gallery at UN headquarters. She made those remarks in Washington, Jim.
Oh, well, fair enough. But here we are on an international broadcast discussing them, so they are heard around the world.
All right. Your reaction to Jim's thoughts on that, Jonathan Wachtel?
Well, first of all of us are taxpayers, right? And, you know, it's easy to say saving $1 million here is insignificant in the general scheme of things. But I don't know about you, but with my family budget, I'm careful about what we spend and where we spend, and I'm not one to throw dollars out the window. So with all due respect, I disagree with what he's saying. I think you need to spend wisely. In terms of what the gentleman said about the U.S. withdrawing from international affairs, I don't quite understand where he's coming from. We're very much engaged. So I disagree with him on a number of counts.
All right, you're saying that very much engaged. A number of diplomatic postings, including Paris, for instance, haven't yet been filled. And he's also done things like send his son-in-law with no foreign policy experience to play a Middle East mediator. That's got to infuriate career diplomats, Jonathan Wachtel.
Look, first of all, Jared Kushner is someone who's pretty well versed in Middle East affairs by nature of who he is as an individual. So while you can criticize him for not having served in the Foreign Service or having been an ambassador overseas in the Middle East, he happens to be a person who's well read in. So it's the president's prerogative to appoint who he wants to appoint to work on that particular portfolio, and he's not doing it alone. He obviously has advisors, and he has the support of the U.S. government and the State Department in what's happening. So he's not doing it alone. It's not like he's out there a cowboy, going out there and running around and trying to do something without any sort of consultation.
Leslie Vincent-Murray, how do you? What are your thoughts when you see Jared Kushner leading Middle East mediation efforts?
Well, the portfolio that Kushner's been given is extremely broad, would challenge even the most expert individual, and he's not the most expert individual. There's extraordinary expertise across the foreign policy area in the United States, and very few people are being well deployed and well used, partly because so many people signed letters saying that they didn't want to support the president, which has, of course, created a problem. But nonetheless, the State Department remains very understaffed at the level of undersecretaries of state, assistant secretaries of state, key ambassadorial posts across critical regions, including Asia. So things have progressed very, very slowly at the level of functionality and personnel and employment, and in a context where there is really extraordinary expertise that could be drawn on, that have worked on these issues across many years and many decades. So it's detrimental. The amount of money that is spent, as the earlier speaker mentioned, on foreign affairs is very minor relative to America's budget. And the ongoing threats, the sort of assaults at the level of budget and what's likely to be appropriated to withdraw money from the State Department, from the UN, are largely counterproductive.
Stephen Yates, why are they so slow to name people to the State Department?
Well, I can't explain the personnel process. I've lived through a few of those, but when you look at what's being done, I mean, there are no presidential summits that are not happening because of staffing not being filled out in the agencies. There are no negotiations that are not happening because of lack of staffing in the administration. In fact, I think critics of the administration are somewhat on the horns of the dilemma. They were not in favor of the things the president campaigned on, and it should be a gift to them that these things are being, functions are being filled by holdovers in the government that are acting in these roles. And really, it's more of the Trump supporters that should be aggrieved that their loyal troops haven't been put in to populate these offices. But the amount of staffing and support that Rex Tillerson has at the State Department is largely a function of Rex Tillerson and his need to work with the White House in getting through the staffing process. But really, there's been a lot of meetings and interactions with leaders and other substantial negotiators among our Asian allies and people talking about North Korea, and frankly, a lot on the Middle East. General Mattis has a lot of support that he's been relying upon, and there's lots of staffing vacancies there too. It's baffling to those of us who've been through these processes for these vacancies to exist this long, but you can't point to a single instance of a conversation of consequence by our leadership where decisions actually get made.
Stephen Yates, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we have to take a very quick break, but we'll pick up. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're looking at Donald Trump's first UN week. Got off to a conciliatory start as he chaired a meeting alongside the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on reforming the world body. We'll go into those speeches on Tuesday with all the other world leaders. We're talking about it with, from New York, Jonathan Wachtel, the former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations. Welcome back as well to former senior White House National Security Advisor Stephen Yates, who is the former chair of the Idaho Republican Party, who joins us from Boise. Jim Arcadis, president of the Progressive Political Action Committee for DPAC. And from London, Leslie Vinja-Murray, who teaches international relations at SOAS, the School of African and Oriental Studies at the University of London. Welcome back to all of you. We were talking before the break about, the state of U.S. diplomacy, what with so many vacancies. We heard Stephen Yates make the argument that, business is being tended to. There are 270 representations for the United States around the world. It's the world's biggest diplomatic reach. What are your thoughts, Jim Arcadis, on where that's going, on what importance is being placed on diplomacy?
I do think, I believe it was Stephen's point earlier, on the level of staffing, yes, meetings are being had. That's fantastic. That's a really, really low bar. And he mentioned that he couldn't think of any single meeting where Trump wasn't prepared. I can think of two just off the top of my head. The G20 summit, when he met with Vladimir Putin and was completely rolled by him, Trump said, "Hey, did you hack the election?" And Putin said, "No, we didn't." Trump said, "Okay, that's cool. Let's move on to the next topic." If I were Russian intelligence services, I would have counseled Putin to do exactly that, to deny everything, and then try and get Trump alone. Trump willingly went up to Putin at dinner later that evening. And then previously, I believe it was in March, when Trump had meetings with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian prime minister, in the White House, and he just went ahead and divulged classified information. Like, that is betraying the national interest of the United States of America. And it's completely shameful that our president would act in that kind of way and willingly go into extremely important bilateral meetings so unprepared. About the state of diplomacy in general, we were talking a little bit about the idea that the United States, what is our role in the world? I can point to a lot of examples where we've seen the United States willingly withdraw under the Trump administration, whether it's trying to beat up on our NATO allies. The cornerstone of his campaign was building a physical wall to remove the United States from the world, to withdraw from the Paris Accord, to outsource our North Korea policy to China, to say that we're going to withdraw from trade agreements like NAFTA. The State Department is talking about cutting human rights and democracy promotion as cornerstones of their mission. The State Department proposed to slash a third of his budget. I mean, I can go on. This is pretty stark stuff and pretty consequential, because it makes the world a less stable place, and it ultimately makes the United States less secure.
On its website, the U.S. State Department states it has a mission statement, and in it says, the American people thrive in a peaceful and interconnected world that is free, resilient, and prosperous. There was a plan that was actually, that's a proposal that was made for a draft email last month. The statement that's on the website itself, also contains the word just and democratic, which, according to the Washington Post, were about to be removed. Working for a more just and democratic world, Jonathan Wachtel, is that the remit of the United States?
Of course we work towards a more democratic and fair world. I mean, it's preposterous to try to make a claim otherwise. It's easy to try to pick up pick apart certain policy things that the administration has been working on that could make it seem that we're in some sort of withdrawal from the world. The truth is that we're still the biggest humanitarian relief provider. We're helping the countries that are going through some of the worst famines in recent history. We're still engaged all over the world. I mean, we still have fully functioning embassies around the world. The State Department, we heard some pretty disparaging things said about some of your participants right now, but it's still functioning, and you still have a wonderfully talented foreign service officers and civil service officers who are working for the government every day, working very hard to formulate and project U.S. policy. So it's kind of crazy to make flippant remarks that we're in some sort of crazy place right now that is utterly dysfunctional.
Leslie Vinjamuri, you're sitting in London, which now has a U.S. ambassador since the start of the month. What's your reaction to what you just heard?
Well, I'm not sure what the disparaging remarks were. What I heard, and partly what I said, was that there are a number of appointments that haven't been made, and that this creates uncertainty. Now, to say that the meetings are still going forward, I think the thing that's being discounted is that those people, and we do have a tremendously devoted and committed and serious Foreign Service. That's absolutely right, the Foreign Service officers and the civil servants who are working in the State Department. But what's happening in the State Department, if you speak to people who are working in the State Department, is that they're faced with a phenomenal amount of uncertainty because they know that the people who are currently in post are not the people who are going to remain in post. They don't have any idea whether their programs are going to be cut, whether they can actually continue to pursue them past the money that's already been appropriated and allocated. And so it becomes very difficult for, yes, tremendously good people who have worked their entire careers in trying to promote human rights and humanitarianism and diplomacy and all sorts of programs that have deep roots. But they're now in a situation where they can't actually do their work appropriately, properly, functionally, and they face a very difficult working environment. So it's not a critique of the people, of our tremendously devoted, longtime civil servants. It's a critique of the constraints that they're finding themselves faced with. Now, the ambassador that's been appointed to the UK is doing a tremendous job so far. He's very new. He's just only recently in post. He tweets up a storm. He's wonderful to follow, and so I think that could be very productive. And there's no doubt that the president has chosen some very good people to place around him. But the overall level, the messages that's coming out, many of the messages that are being delivered to our allies from no less than the president are often very dispiriting and have created a very difficult environment, even for the people that most support the president, right? The people in the White House, the people in his cabinet. There's a level of dysfunctionality that's coming as a result of the words that the president himself is using and deploying.
Jonathan Wachtel, in Politico, there was a piece this Monday that said that the problems perhaps with the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and it openly wondered if Nikki Haley, your former boss, shouldn't be lining herself up or is already lining herself up to perhaps take his job. She does not view herself as someone who reports to Tillerson, says the article. People who have worked with both principals said she regularly video conferences into National Security Council meetings and speaks freely with the press, often charting her own course without seeking sign-off from the White House or the State Department. Jonathan, would she make a better Secretary of State?
Look, I'm not going to get into whether she would make a better Secretary of State. They both have completely different talents in some areas. So, she's a politician coming into this role. He's a CEO of Exxon. They come from different worlds completely and different styles of approaching crises, of approaching public engagement. They're very different individuals. What I do want to emphasize is that there is full cooperation between, for instance, the U.S. mission to the United Nations and the State Department. When I was working at the mission, I was a State Department employee. I was on the phone daily, multiple times, and messaging back and forth with emails with my State Department counterparts on coordination of efforts, on statements, on making sure that we're in sync with one another.
Yeah, but the
So,
criticism
you know,
that's leveled, Jonathan, is that she is tapped in to what it takes to do international diplomacy, but that Rex Tillerson is shut off, basically, from the rest of the diplomatic corps, very isolated.
First of all, Rex Tillerson has been globe-trekking a lot in terms of going to various countries, certainly trying to mediate the problem that Qatar's having with its Gulf neighbors. You know, the guy's out there and doing his thing. It's just a stylistic thing. In terms of Nikki, you know, she's a very adept at public engagement. You know, she's very good in front of the camera, articulate, and capable of carrying her own in front of the press, or, you know, giving speeches or whatever it is. It's a stylistic thing in terms of who would make a better Secretary of State. You know, they both have different skills that they can bring to bear that they try to use to the best of their ability to be able to formulate policy.
Stephen Yates, you know, because you're a former chair of a state Republican party, that there's a split, right, between those who are more isolationists, who want this America First concept, and those who want the U.S. to play a more proactive role on the international stage and to do the kind of things that we were talking about earlier in terms of promoting democracy and on the international level. At this point in time, is Trump going to have to either betray one side or the other?
Well, really, this is, I think, one of the least covered stories in all of this. Out across the country and among the grassroots of the Republican Party, and really just in general, it's not really a question of isolation or engagement. It's Donald Trump was elected largely because of a groundswell wanting different results, better results, and rebalancing of a lot of these relationships. And so they wanted someone to go and disrupt the system to try to settle it back into a better pattern for our interests. So when you think of what a lot of grassroots Republicans are hoping from the United Nations, it's that the president would challenge them to do more. I mean, you think of North Korea, that is a multi-decade priority that's been on the United Nations plate. And here we are in some of the most desperate situation. And I think that a lot of Americans want to know, what is the world community really willing to do, as opposed to, is the United States going to carry a burden alone to solve a problem?
Jim Markakis, you agree that it's basically an issue of a different strategy to try to get a similar result?
Well, if we're talking about results, like, let's just pick apart what's happened in North Korea over the course of the last several months. I mean, how many long-range missiles have they shot off? They've become ever more bellicose over the course of the Trump administration than they had been in the several years prior, when there was a containment and engagement strategy. So, you know, if the groundswell of the American populace elected Donald Trump to get different results that would, you know, have the world cower in fear of the United States, he's getting an F. And it's not even a close call. You know, I'd also note that over the course of the last 10 minutes or so, we've had a discussion about, you know, basic functions of the Department of State, like, yes, the bureaucracy is working and, you know, people are getting advice and things like that. It's a ridiculous discussion to have that we are at that base level, that United States diplomacy and the diplomatic bureaucracy is still
that they need new allies, that they need to move things forward, not entirely without the United States, but there's sort of a walk-around strategy that's developing. So we see the Europeans speaking more to the Chinese. We saw Angela Merkel meeting with the Chinese in the lead up to the G20. And I think what we're likely to see in the coming weeks and months is much more of this as the U.S. becomes absolutely always important because of the sheer influence and the sheer power that it has. But with the unpredictability, inevitably other countries are going to be looking to move the ball forward on a number of issues. in the absence of United States participation, if that's what it takes. And I think one of the most problematic arenas is of course Asia. It's not only North Korea, and it is accurate to say that problem has been a long time coming. But the decision to sort of retreat and really only exercise hard power and threats in the entire region, not to engage in the Trans-Pacific Partnership regionally to increase America's soft power to shape norms and standards and trade patterns in that region, I think is a mistake that will prove to be a very strategic error, and that is something that will sit on the back of this particular administration.
Stephen,
but when it comes to...
Go ahead.
When it comes to North Korea, absolutely, this was going to be the presidency, no matter who won the White House, that was going to have to deal with a North Korea that had the ability to put a nuclear warhead on an ICBM that could hit the United States. But the question of the response, I think, is one that was going to vary very much across this administration and whoever else might have been in the White House. And that comes down very much to the language and the rhetoric, and that matters in terms of how it plays, how the North Koreans respond, how the other relevant partners respond. The diplomacy, the words absolutely are critical. And at the moment, they seem to be very incendiary, not helpful.
All right, I just want to get back to the point you made a moment ago about the trade issues. Back in January, when Trump was sworn in, and there were fights, as you mentioned, with Europe, Asia, Mexico, Canada over the America First policy. Stephen Yates, it was a surprising sight to see China's president, Xi Jinping, sort of acting as the guardian of the temple of free trade, if you will, in that speech he gave at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Do you take the point that Leslie Vincent-Murray makes?
That's a frequently made point. It doesn't really match with my experience. I mean, we have a lot of overanalysis of the early parts of an administration. I've been through transitions, and trade policy is often not set in the first year of an administration. Things kind of get tried to shape the environment, and you push things through over the course of a coming year or two or three. So there's a lot of chapters of this to unfold. Taking the policies of the last administration and they're being changed rather than continuity. I mean, at the beginning of the Bush administration, there was fretting about would the Bush administration walk away from treaties negotiated by the Clinton administration, and that happened. And other things moved on from there. And so I think there's a little bit of overanalysis on this. And frankly, a lot of our allies, there's no shortage of trips back and forth between the leaders of Korea, Japan, and other major allies to the United States, or the other way around. There's the same amount of interaction, negotiation as I saw in the first year of the Bush administration, and frankly, that I witnessed from the outside of the Obama administration. And so it's really all in the results of where this settles on trade and other issues. But for now, the national security challenge of North Korea is going to dominate that, no matter what agenda someone was pursuing on climate change or trade.
And we'll have to leave it there. Wait and see the message from Stephen Yates. I want to thank you for joining us from Boise, Idaho. I want to thank as well Leslie Vincent-Murray in London, Jonathan Wachtel at UN headquarters in New York, and Jim Arkadis in Washington. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
So he read his speech today.
He read his speech, and actually we have some people... I'll go to that first, actually. We have one person applauding him. I'd like to congratulate Donald Trump, says Chanel Van Voren, on being able to read. Now, this, of course, is a regular...
Oh, that's...
It's a bit on... That's, she's being facetious. But, of course, there is frequently this analysis of whether does he use a prompter, does he read the script, or does he go completely off script? Well, today, he's been congratulated by some, if not entirely sincerely, for sticking to the prompter. This is Politico.com. Trump's UN obsession collides with reality. So this is a little analysis piece by Richard Gowan. I'll just quickly run through one of the elements of that article. Trump has publicly questioned whether the sanctions will work. This is, again, about North Korea. Trump's UN obsession colliding with reality. So what they're looking at here is the biggest national security test of his presidency so far. And despite his attitude where in the past he has said he wants to be unilateralist, outright isolationist, his foreign policy is leaning hard on the world's main multilateral body to manage the main crisis on his agenda. In other words, he needs to work through the Security Council. So that's one take on things here. Despite all of the rhetoric, he actually needs the UN on this one. But of course, we've been seeing other elements of analysis pointing to his continually antagonistic language. Trump mocks Rocket Man Kim Jong-un as advisors issue warnings. He appeared to ridicule the North Korean leader. And of course, a lot of people are concerned about that it could quite literally backfire. Elsewhere, thumbs up for Donald Trump coming from Fox News and other media that are generally pro-Trump right now. Listen up, UN. Trump means what he's telling you. In other words, they seem to be backing the idea that reforms are required in the UN. The Le Monde just pointing out the vagueness of his suggested reforms. I guess we'll be getting some more details on that in his speech tomorrow. So Donald Trump attacking the UN, but remaining quite vague, says Le Monde. Elsewhere, yes, that's what I'm talking about. Trump slams the UN in his first UN appearance. So as ever, on social media, highly polarized when it comes to Donald Trump's reform suggestions. You have people in favor of that and people critical of it. Ian Bremner has found what he thinks to be the person who is least impressed with Donald Trump's UN speech. And indeed, I haven't actually identified who she is, but she does not look entirely... I think she's doing a duck face involuntarily. Some initial reaction coming in there to the bilateral discussions or the meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu. This is Haaretz.com, the left-leaning Israeli daily. On the Palestinians, Trump and Netanyahu are synchronized, talk, no action. So there's an opinion piece there about, well, that sums it up pretty well. Talk, no action vis-a-vis Palestine. And also, this is a French-based academic, Iranian. Iran no longer a hot topic, despite Trump and Bibi's efforts to portray it this way. I guess we're not going to be seeing, well, who knows what we'll be seeing from Benjamin Netanyahu's speech.
He's giving a speech on Tuesday as well.
I wonder, I suppose, will it contain the cartoonish elements of a few years back? Perhaps not. So for some, the Iran issue is not such a hot topic as it once was. I guess there'll be plenty more reaction and comment.
Oh, there will be plenty over the next week.
Right. It's going to get even more heated, I imagine.
James Creedon, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you. And by the way, our coverage of UN Week continues also on our website, France24.com.